The broken note, very good, yeah. We talked about what was going on when Taps was played at the funeral of John Kennedy. We said that after playing of Taps, the American flag that draped the President's coffin was folded by the military casket bearers and given to Mrs. Kennedy. At 3:13 p.m., Jackie, Robert, and Edward Kennedy all took turns lighting what now stands as the eternal flame at the gravesite of President John F. Kennedy. 3:13 p.m., Jackie, Robert, and Edward Kennedy all took turns lighting the eternal flame. This is pretty cool. You'll get a chance to see it. It really was Mrs. Kennedy's final tribute to her husband. The flame burns 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And it has been stopped on 2 occasions. One is a Catholic nun went there and poured holy water on it, got a little bit too much, and put the flame out. That's a few years ago. And the second time happened when they changed it, because they had to redo it after the years it's been redone as far as the flame goes. But it is pretty cool. It's a gas flame, and it's right in the middle of the gravesite. And I'll show you a picture of it. It's really, really cool. When Jackie Kennedy was asked about the eternal flame and why she did that, she said simply, "It was my personal tribute to the man who, quote, asked not what his country could do for him, but what he could do for his country." That was her quote. So the eternal flame was Jackie Kennedy's personal tribute to who she said it was to the man who asked not what his country could do for him, but what he could do for his country. Well, after the burial, the Kennedy party and everyone else left Arlington National Cemetery, but later that night, Agent Clint Hill escorted both Jackie and Robert Kennedy back to Arlington so they could view the burial site and the eternal flame privately. So later that evening, Secret Service Agent Clint Hill escorted both Robert and Jackie Kennedy back to Arlington National Cemetery because they wanted to view the burial site and the eternal flame privately. Both Jackie and Robert knelt and prayed for about 15 minutes at the burial site and then left. Another thing I would tell you, obviously you don't have to write down, is the burial site doesn't look today like it did then. It actually had kind of a white picket fence around it, and of course it was new. And since then they have brought in really nice stones and moss rock. And has anybody in here been there and seen it? Yeah, it's pretty cool, isn't it? And it's been redone, so it's different now than it was then. Over time it kind of evolutionized into a nicer, more put together landscape type gravesite. It's very cool. And it's the most visited grave site in Arlington Cemetery, obviously. Okay, we're going to move on to some final thoughts on the death of JFK. And I really don't want you to write these down. I want you to just kind of listen to some of the quotes and some of the things that were said. And I'll tell you when you need to write some things down. I'm going to give you 5 thoughts and quotes about the life and the death of President John F. Kennedy. And again, Mrs. Kennedy did a lot of reflection after her husband's death, and she was asked to sum up the life of her late husband. And she did so by taking a paragraph from his famous book that we've talked about, Profiles in Courage. And so when she was asked to sum up the life of her late husband, she said, I'm going to read a quote from his book, Profiles in Courage. And this is the quote that she referred to. She said, "The courage of life is often a less dramatic spectacle than the courage of the final moment, but is no less than a magnificent mixture of triumph and tragedy. A man does what he must, in spite of personal consequences, in spite of obstacles and dangers and pressures, and that is the basis of all human morality." That's how she summed up the life of her husband from the quote in Profiles in Courage. Another thing you need to realize is after the death of John F. Kennedy, politicians, his friends, the media, authors, I mean a lot of people, I've got I don't know how many books written by how many different authors on President John F. Kennedy. And all of them really inflated what he had really accomplished in his first 1,000 days in office. And that's, you know, just kind of normal. And one journalist wrote, and I think this is a great quote about that. He said, "Robbed of his years, he is being rewarded and honored in death as he never was in life. Deprived of the place he sought in history, he has been given a place in legend." And I think that's very true, because we all remember, especially when you get my age and you get old, you all remember how great you used to be, right? How good of an athlete you were and how smart you were. And it's always a little bit inflated from probably what it really was. And I think Kennedy's certainly was more popular in death than maybe he would have been in life. There was lots of talk about whether he could win an election in '64. There were some things coming out in his private life that weren't good, some of the things he had been doing. He was going to face a very strong challenge from George Romney in the election, and there were some thoughts that he may not get reelected in '64, and he was really at the cusp of dumping Lyndon Johnson too, because he really didn't like him. So who knows what history would have been if he would have lived, but certainly he was more reviewed as a legend in death than he was life. Mike Mansfield, one time when we were in Washington, D.C., when he was alive, when we visited him, one of the kids asked, how great do you think was he the greatest president ever? And he said, could have been, but never had the opportunity. So really, you know, Senator Kennedy missed a lot of roll calls when he was senator and he became president. And he was a good president, but I think he's remembered again way more in death than he ever would have been in life, popularity-wise. This is kind of an interesting quote I want you to pay attention to. One of President Kennedy's quotes that probably best summed up the tragedy of his death and what could have been was this. He said one time, he said, "It has been recently suggested that whether I serve 1 or 2 terms in the presidency, I will find myself at the end of that period at what might be considered the awkward age. Too old to begin a new career and too young to write my memoirs." Because he was a young president, so if he would have been elected in 2 terms, he would have been about 50 when he got done. And being 50 years old, it's hard to go get another job is his point, but yet he's too young to write about his life because he's in the middle of it. So I think that really summed up, you know, the tragedy of his death and what could have been, is that he didn't know what he was going to do after serving the 2 terms. He was too young to write his memoirs and too old to get another job. Rose Kennedy, this is a gal I always felt sorry for. You think about our discussions on the Kennedys, how many children did she lost? And she's going to lose another one in Robert F. Kennedy, who's going to run for the presidency in '68, is going to be assassinated. She was quoted when asked about the tragic deaths within her family. She said, "It has been said, time heals all wounds. I do not agree. The wounds remain. In time, the mind, protecting its sanity, covers them with scar tissue and the pain lessens, but it's never gone." You think about the Kennedy family, Mrs. Kennedy, how many tragedies they went through. Now, how many people have heard of the Kennedy presidency being called Camelot? Anybody heard that before? Has Mr. McGee not got into that with you AP Lit kids? Okay, you know, you look, here's a book right here I have. It says, Life in Camelot, the Kennedy Years. Okay, those of you that might be in Mr. McGee's AP class that's talked about this, what is Camelot, Cherith? What is Camelot?
It's Arthur's round table.
King Arthur and his round table, right? What else do you know about Camelot? Anybody know anything about Camelot? It was about King Arthur and his court, the royalty of a leadership and administration. What else? What's that?
Wasn't the greatest rule.
The greatest rule. Okay, well,
it's a round table, so there's no head of the table.
Right.
They're all equals.
okay, all right. Well, I'm going to tell you how the myth of Camelot came about. A lot of people think Kennedy's administration was called Camelot during the administration. Not true. It never got the name until after he was assassinated. And there was a reason for that. Here's what happens. Kind of an interesting story. You might want to write some of this down. Just 1 week after the assassination of President Kennedy, Jackie Kennedy summoned a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist by the name of Theodore H. White to the family compound in Hyannisport, Massachusetts. Okay? Again, just a week after the president's assassination, Jackie Kennedy summoned a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist by the name of Theodore H. White and asked him to come to the Kennedy family compound in Hyannisport, Massachusetts. Now, the reason she called Theodore H. White, other than the fact he was a very distinguished writer, is that he had become a confidant of President Kennedy during the 1960 presidential campaign. Someone in the media that Kennedy trusted when he was running for president in 1960, and he took an affection to Theodore White and trusted Theodore White would write things about him that were true, you know what I mean, and not exaggerate. Well, the reason Jackie summoned Theodore White is she wanted to rescue her husband from, quote, the bitter old men who write history. So the reason she summoned Theodore White to come and visit with her, or interview her, so to speak, is because she wanted to rescue her husband from, quote, the bitter old men who write history. What does she mean by that? She wants to rescue him from the bitter old men that write history. Critics, yeah, she doesn't want him to be criticized. She wants this legacy that we now see today, because he had a lot of faults. A lot of faults. and those never really came out till many years later. Well, Mrs. Kennedy was really struggling because she wanted to find an appropriate classical metaphor for her husband's presidency. She wanted to have a name other than the new frontier. She wanted it to have a name that would be classical, that would be a metaphor, that when you said it, you would think of the Kennedy years. So she wanted to have Theodore White assist her in finding this appropriate classical metaphor for her husband's presidency. So what does Theodore White do? He sits down with Mrs. Kennedy, he interviews her for a long period of time, takes a lot of notes, and eventually writes a 1,000-word essay on his interview with Mrs. Kennedy. So during his interview with Mrs. Kennedy, he takes careful notes, and he eventually takes these notes and writes a 1,000-word essay on the Kennedy myth, or the Kennedy administration. And in this historic essay, he compares the Kennedy administration and the Kennedy years in the White House to Camelot, to King Arthur, to royalty. King Arthur and his court, and the Round Table, in which people got somewhat of an equal say. And from that point on in history, the administration of John F. Kennedy became known as Camelot. And the timing was pretty good because Camelot was also a Broadway musical about the court of King Arthur and his knights, and it opened in December of 1960 on Broadway, just weeks after JFK was elected. So that's where they kind of grabbed that metaphor from, is the fact that Camelot was a very popular Broadway musical that was appearing in New York City, and it came out just a couple of weeks after JFK's election. And because of Jackie's persistence and Theodore White's essay on the Kennedy presidency, John F. Kennedy's years in the office have often been referred to as Camelot. Why would they do that? What would King Arthur and his court have? They would have high ideals, chivalry, knights in shining armor of the medieval legend, an imaginary place where everything was great. And that's what the Kennedy administration was compared to, thus the name Camelot. Well, it consumed the American people, and if you talk to people my age or older, maybe a little younger, and say, hey, what is Camelot? Most of them wouldn't say King Arthur and his court. Most of them would say that was John F. Kennedy's presidency. Okay? Now, again, I want you to emphasize to you that that did not come about until after his assassination. And a lot of people think it was named during, it was not. Now, there's a new movie out called Jackie. I don't know if you've seen it or are interested in it. It came out about a year ago. Forget the actress that stars, but she did a very good job. Does anybody know what I'm talking about there? Natalie Portman, there you go. And the whole thing is basically about what we just talked about. Her interview and her struggles after the assassination, having Theodore White come in and this image of Camelot. It's a very good movie. Bobby Kennedy, the guy that portrays Bobby Kennedy, has a couple of F-bombs in there, and that's probably why it's rated R, because it really doesn't have much in it. But I mean, if you're bored on a weekend and want to see something interesting, that would be a good movie to watch. Okay, we'll move on then to some other things I'll tell you. Tidbits on the Kennedy assassination. A few tidbits. Tell you a few things you may or may not know. I find this first thing pretty interesting in general. Okay, we're going to go back to 1917. Ironically, the same year that John F. Kennedy is born, 1917. And we're going to tell you that in that year, Congress passed a law that made it a federal offense to threaten to kill the President of the United States. Still is there today. If I stand up on video here in my lecture and tell you that I'm going to assassinate the President of the United States, and anybody sees that matters in our federal government and thinks I'm serious, they're going to come and arrest me, and it's a felony. Even if you don't mean it, it is a felony offense. And that was passed in 1917 when Congress passed a law making it a federal offense to threaten to kill the President of the United States. You know what it didn't cover?
Actually doing it?
The killing of the President of the United States. And it wasn't until 1965, after the assassination of President Kennedy, that Congress passed a law making it a federal offense to kill the President of the United States. So how would Lee Harvey Oswald be tried for murder, being we didn't have a federal offense to kill the President? Well, he killed a person, right? So he's going to be tried of murder just like anybody else would be on anybody, whether it be the President or some bum living under a bridge. The murder was a murder. Didn't have any more emphasis. Until 1965, when Congress passed a law that made it a federal offense to kill the President of the United States. I just think that's kind of amazing when you think about that. Now, how many presidents prior to Kennedy had been killed at the hands of an assassin? We should know this. One. Where are we at in those? We'll get those notebooks out from last year. Who do you have? Abraham Lincoln, James Garfield, and William McKinley. So Kennedy becomes the fourth president to be assassinated while in office. Lincoln, Garfield, McKinley, Kennedy. You know what's weird about that? Is all four of those presidents that were assassinated were elected in a 0 year. Lincoln was elected in 1860, Garfield 1880, McKinley 1900, and John Kennedy 1960. It's kind of weird, isn't it? All four assassinated presidents were elected in a 0 year. You know how many presidents have died in office? Anybody want to guess? We know 4 have, right? How many presidents have died in office? You want the dates on this? Okay, Lincoln 1860, Garfield 1880, McKinley 1900, and Kennedy 1960. How many? 7. Who said that? 7. Okay, so let's see if we can figure out who is the first president to die in office. Did not get assassinated but caught a hell of a cold. Yeah, William Henry Harrison. William Henry Harrison was the first president to die in office. Followed by Lincoln, who was assassinated. Followed by Garfield, who was assassinated. Followed by McKinley, who was assassinated. President Warren Harding died in office. Warren Harding. Warren Harding. Who else died in office? And Kennedy's the 7th. Who was the 6th? FDR, Franklin Roosevelt. Do you know that all 7 of those presidents who died in office were all elected in a 0 year? True story. Harrison, 1840. Lincoln, 1860. Garfield, 1880. McKinley, 1900. Harding, 1920. Franklin Roosevelt, one of his 4 times, 1940. And John Kennedy, 1960. It's kind of interesting, don't you think? Now, let's move on to something you may be interested in, and you may know a little about, and that's the Lincoln-Kennedy coincidences. Okay? You might know some of these, maybe you know them all, but they're kind of interesting. I'm going to give you 19 coincidences between Lincoln and Kennedy and their assassinations. Okay? 19. You're going to need to know a couple of these for the test, not all of them, obviously. but some that stick out in your mind. Let's start with number 1. Lincoln was elected to Congress in 1846. Kennedy was elected to Congress in 1946, exactly 100 years apart. Okay? Lincoln's elected to Congress in 1846, Kennedy 1946, 100 years apart. Lincoln was elected president in 1860. Kennedy obviously was elected president in 1960, 100 years apart. Lincoln's elected in 1860, Kennedy 1960. Number 3, both men were deeply involved in civil rights for Negroes. Number 3, both men were deeply involved in civil rights for Negroes. Number 4, both men were assassinated on a Friday. Both men were assassinated on a Friday. Number 5, both men were assassinated in the presence of their wives, each sitting right next to their husband when they were killed. Both men were assassinated in the presence of their wives. Number 6, not sure if you know this or not, but each of the wives had lost a son while living in the White House. Mrs. Lincoln lost a son who died, and obviously the Kennedys did as well with who? Patrick, remember? So both wives lost a son while living in the White House. I get a kid. Some of these other ones are kind of crazy, but number 7. This is all the same one, by the way. Lincoln was killed in Ford's Theater, right? Kennedy in a Ford automobile, a Lincoln Continental. So Lincoln was killed